The air on the ridge crackled with a tension that tasted of ozone and dread. Below, a sea of steel and ambition stirred, a vast French host shimmering under the late August sun. Rain had fallen earlier, a brief, violent squall that left the ground soft and the air thick with the smell of damp earth and churned mud. From a vantage point near a rustic windmill, a king watched, his gaze sweeping over his own men, a force dwarfed by the enemy but positioned with a grim, calculating precision. Every detail of the landscape, every gentle slope and deceptive dip had been considered, woven into a tapestry of defense that would either hold firm or be torn asunder, leaving his kingdom vulnerable and his claim to the French throne a forgotten whisper in the halls of power. At stake was more than just a single battle. The very future of England as a significant military power hung in the balance. For years, the war had been a series of indecisive skirmishes and costly sieges. Now deep in enemy territory, with a weary army and the full might of France arrayed against them, this was a moment of reckoning. A defeat here would not simply mean the loss of an army. It would shatter the English king's authority, embolden his enemies, and likely spell the end of his continental ambitions. The weight of this rested on the shoulders of the man who had chosen this ground, who had defied the cautious counsel of his advisors and dared to face a foe that, by all conventional wisdom, was destined to crush them. King Edward III of England, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unyielding as the crown he wore, stood as the architect of this desperate gamble. He was a warrior king, seasoned in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, and he had brought with him not just an army, but a revolution. His forces were a blend of old and new, of grizzled knights and yeoman archers, each man handpicked for his skill and resilience. He had also brought with him a secret, a weapon that belched smoke and thunder, a novelty that many of his own men viewed with suspicion. But it was in the hands of his archers, and in the strange, dark powder of his cannons, that he placed his faith. Could this audacious king, so heavily outnumbered, truly defy the might of the French chivalry on their own soil? Could his novel tactics and unproven weapons overcome the sheer weight of numbers and the centuries-old tradition of the mounted knight? Or would this field, so carefully chosen, become the graveyard of his ambitions, a testament to the folly of challenging the established order of warfare? The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer that would be written in blood and iron. As the French advanced, a chaotic and overconfident tide of men and horses, the English held their ground. Then on Edward's signal, a storm of a different kind broke upon the field. A blizzard of arrows, released from the powerful English longbows, filled the air, a deadly rain that fell upon the French ranks with terrifying force. Almost simultaneously, a series of deafening roars echoed from the English lines as their primitive cannons unleashed their fury, spewing iron and smoke into the already panicked French advance. The result was a slaughter. The French charges, broken and disordered, faltered in the face of this unprecedented onslaught. By nightfall, the flower of French nobility lay dead or dying in the mud, their pride and their power shattered. The Battle of Crécy, fought on August 26, 1346, was not merely a victory, it was a revolution. It was a brutal and undeniable demonstration that the age of the mounted knight, the very symbol of medieval warfare, was drawing to a close. A new era had dawned, an era where disciplined infantry, armed with devastating ranged weapons, could stand against and defeat the most powerful armies in Europe. History, in its relentless and often violent march, is forever shaped by such moments, when innovation and audacity clash with tradition, and the world is irrevocably changed. The story of that day truly began months earlier, with a decision born of frustration and strategic necessity. Edward III's campaign in Normandy had been a chevauchée, a brutal raid designed to inflict maximum economic and psychological damage. His army, a lean and mobile force, had cut a swath of destruction through some of France's richest lands, burning towns and sowing terror. This was not warfare as the French nobility understood it, not the chivalrous clash of equals, but something more primal and terrifying. They saw it as the work of brigands, not of a true king. The French king, Philip VI, had been goaded into action. He could not stand by while his kingdom was ravaged, his authority undermined. He amassed a colossal army, drawing nobles and their retinues from across his vast realm. The sheer size of his force was intended to be a statement, a demonstration of the overwhelming power of France. It was an army built on the traditional foundations of feudal power, the heavily armored knight on his warhorse, the embodiment of social and military prestige. This was the force that now hunted Edward, confident in its ability to crush the upstart English king. Edward's army, in contrast, was a more pragmatic and diverse force. The backbone of his army was not the nobility, but the common man, the yeoman archer. These were men who had spent their lives mastering the longbow, a weapon of immense power and skill. It was a weapon that required years of dedicated practice to use effectively, a testament to a society that was beginning to value military proficiency over noble birth. This was a cultural as well as a military shift, one that was about to be tested in the crucible of battle. Accompanying the archers were the dismounted men-at-arms, knights and nobles who had been ordered to fight on foot. This in itself was a significant tactical innovation. It transformed the traditionally offensive role of the knight into a solid, defensive anchor for the army. This willingness to adapt, to abandon the glorious cavalry charge for the grim reality of a defensive stand, was a hallmark of Edward's military thinking. It was a practicality that his French counterparts, steeped in the traditions of chivalry, found difficult to comprehend. And then there were the cannons. These were not the massive, siege-breaking artillery pieces of later centuries. They were small, primitive, and likely as dangerous to their own crews as to the enemy. But their psychological impact could not be underestimated. In an age where the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves were the familiar sounds of battle, the roar of a cannon was something otherworldly, a terrifying and unnatural sound that could sow confusion and fear. Edward was not just fielding an army, he was unleashing a symphony of destruction. As the French army approached the English position at Crécy, their confidence was palpable. They saw a small, tired army trapped with its back to the sea. They saw an opportunity for a glorious and decisive victory. Philip's advisors urged caution, suggesting that they wait until the next day to attack, to allow their entire force to assemble and rest. But the French nobility, eager for glory and disdainful of their English opponents, would not be restrained. Their impatience, their arrogance, would be a critical factor in the unfolding tragedy. The battlefield itself was a character in this drama. Edward had chosen his ground with a master's eye. His army was positioned on a gentle slope, giving his archers a clear field of fire and forcing the French to attack uphill. The flanks were protected by the village of Crécy and the River May, making it difficult for the French to envelop his smaller force. He had also ordered his men to dig a series of small pits and trenches in front of their lines, a simple but effective measure to disrupt a cavalry charge. The first act of the battle was a duel between the archers. Philip sent his Genoese crossbowmen forward to soften up the English lines. The crossbow was a powerful weapon, but it was slow to reload, and its effectiveness was hampered by the wet conditions, which had loosened the strings of their bows. The English longbowmen, in contrast, could protect their bowstrings from the rain and unleash a far greater volume of fire. The Genoese were caught in a storm of arrows, their ranks decimated before they could even get within effective range. What happened next was a study in chaos. The retreating Genoese collided with the vanguard of the French cavalry, which was already advancing in a disorganized and impatient charge. The French knights, seeing the crossbowmen falling back, were filled with contempt. In their minds, these common mercenaries were cowards, and in their frustration, they began to hack their way through their own allies. This initial confusion and lack of discipline would set the tone for the rest of the battle. The English archers, seeing the disarray in the French ranks, continued to pour a relentless stream of arrows into the struggling mass of men and horses. The sky was said to have grown dark with the sheer number of projectiles. The sound was a constant, terrifying hum, punctuated by the screams of the wounded. The longbows, with their high rate of fire and their ability to pierce armor at close range, were proving to be the decisive weapon of the day. The French cavalry, the pride of their army, charged again and again. Each charge was a wave of courage and futility. They were met with the same disciplined resistance, the same withering hail of arrows. The slope, slick with mud and blood, became a death trap. Horses, maddened by pain and fear, stumbled and fell, throwing their riders to the ground where they were easily dispatched by the English foot soldiers. The age of chivalry was dying in the mud of Crécy. One of the most poignant and legendary moments of the battle involved the blind King John of Bohemia. Hearing that the battle was going against the French, he ordered his knights to tie their horses' bridles to his own and lead him into the thick of the fighting, so that he might strike a blow with his own sword. It was a gesture of incredible bravery, a final defiant act of a dying chivalric. He and his retinue were found the next day, their horses still tied together, slain amidst the carnage. Edward's son, the 16-year-old Edward, the Black Prince, commanded one of the English divisions. At one point in the battle, his position was heavily pressed, and a messenger was sent to the king to request reinforcements. Edward, watching from his vantage point at the windmill, refused. "Let the boy win his spurs," he is reported to have said, a testament to his confidence in his son and in the strength of their position. The prince and his men held their ground, and his reputation as a formidable warrior was forged in the fires of Crécy. As the sun began to set, the French attacks became more sporadic, more desperate. The sheer scale of their losses was becoming apparent. Entire noble families had been wiped out, a generation of French leadership slain in a single afternoon. Philip VI himself was wounded and was eventually persuaded to leave the battlefield, a king defeated not just by a foreign army, but by the dawning of a new reality in warfare. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. The English, moving through the field by torchlight, were stunned by the number of fallen French nobles. Edward ordered his heralds to identify the dead, a grim accounting of the extent of his victory. The losses were staggering, a testament to the brutal efficiency of the English longbow and the catastrophic failure of French tactics. The English, by contrast, had suffered remarkably few casualties. The victory at Crécy had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It allowed Edward to march to Calais and lay siege to the city, which would become a vital English foothold in France for the next 2 centuries. It shattered the myth of the invincibility of the French knight and established the English longbowman as the most feared soldier in Europe. It was a victory that would be celebrated in England for generations, a source of national pride and a symbol of their martial prowess. The battle also had a profound impact on the psychology of the 100 Years' War. For the English, it was a validation of their tactics and a huge boost to their morale. For the French, it was a national trauma, a humiliation that would take years to overcome. The defeat led to a period of political instability in France, as the monarchy struggled to cope with the loss of so many of its leading nobles and the immense cost of the war. The story of Crécy is often told as a simple tale of the longbow's triumph over the crossbow. But it was more complex than that. It was a victory of combined arms, of disciplined infantry working in concert with devastating ranged weapons. It was a victory of tactical foresight and adaptability over rigid and outdated traditions. Edward's decision to dismount his knights, his careful selection of the battlefield, and his use of new and terrifying weapons all played a crucial role. The cannons, while not decisive in a purely military sense, were a portent of things to come. They represented the slow, inexorable rise of gunpowder warfare, a force that would eventually render even the longbow obsolete. Crécy was a transitional battle, a moment in history where the old and the new clashed with spectacular and bloody results. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a future that would be dominated not by the noble knight, but by the common soldier and the power of technology. The mystery of Crécy, the element that still fascinates historians and storytellers, is how such a complete and devastating victory could have been achieved against such overwhelming odds. Was it simply a matter of superior weaponry and tactics, or was there something else at play, a confluence of factors that created the perfect storm for an English victory? The arrogance of the French nobility, the fortunate timing of the rainstorm, the strategic genius of Edward III, all of these elements combined to produce a result that shocked the medieval world. The legacy of Crécy can be seen in the battlefields that followed. At Poitiers and Agincourt, the English would once again use the longbow to inflict devastating defeats on the French. The lessons of Crécy were learned at great cost by the French, who would eventually adapt their own tactics and begin to incorporate more infantry and ranged units into their armies. The 100 Years' War was a long and brutal conflict, and Crécy was one of its most important and defining moments. The voices of the men who fought at Crécy are largely lost to us now. We have the accounts of chroniclers, the records of kings and nobles, but the thoughts and fears of the common archer, the man whose skill and courage won the day, are mostly silent. Yet we can imagine them, standing in their ranks on that muddy hillside, their knuckles white as they drew their bows, their hearts pounding in their chests as the might of France bore down on them. They were the agents of a profound and lasting change, the architects of a new way of war. The tale of Crécy is a reminder that history is not a static or predictable thing. It is a chaotic and often violent process, shaped by the decisions of individuals, the clash of cultures, and the relentless march of technology. It is a story of how a small, determined nation, through innovation and discipline, could challenge and defeat a far greater power. It is a story that has been told and retold for centuries, a testament to the enduring power of a single, decisive moment to change the course of history. As we look back on that distant battlefield, we are not just observing a historical event, we are witnessing a paradigm shift. The fall of the French knights at Crécy was more than just a military defeat. It was a crack in the very foundations of the medieval world. The social order built on the premise of a noble warrior class was shaken to its core. The common man, armed with a simple yet deadly weapon, had proven that he could be the equal and even the superior of the most powerful lord. The story of the early cannons at Crécy adds another layer of mystery and intrigue. How did Edward manage to transport these cumbersome and unreliable weapons across hostile territory? What was the true extent of their impact on the battle? Were they merely a psychological weapon, or did they inflict significant casualties? The answers to these questions are shrouded in the fog of history, but their presence on the battlefield is a clear indication that a new and terrible force was entering the world of warfare. The English longbow, the star of the show at Crécy, was more than just a piece of wood and string. It was the product of a unique military culture, one that encouraged and rewarded archery skills from a young age. It was a weapon that required not just strength, but also a lifetime of practice to master. The English victory at Crécy was not just a triumph of technology, it was a triumph of a society that had invested in the military potential of its common people. In the end, the Battle of Crécy is a story about the power of ideas. It is about the idea that a well-disciplined army, fighting in a strong defensive position, can overcome superior numbers. It is about the idea that new weapons and new tactics can render old certainties obsolete. It is about the idea that the course of history can be changed not just by kings and nobles, but by the collective will and skill of ordinary men. And that is a story that will continue to resonate as long as there are battles to be fought and stories to be told.